Hey everybody and welcome to the video. I am Mike B and today we're going to be talking about the German military helmet from 1916 to 2022, going in a little bit into the future at the time of me making this video, but we're only a few days out from the new year. Anyway, we're going to be talking about West German helmets. I'm not going to be talking about East German helmets in this particular video because that would make the video too long. I'll be making a separate video on that later. Before we get started, I'd like to thank the sponsors of this video, my Patreon supporters and YouTube channel members. You guys are fantastic. You guys have allowed me to make so much cool content that I never thought would be possible without support from the community. So I really appreciate each and every one of you. If you want to support my work, you can also click the link in the description and become a Patreon supporter yourself. Now, without further ado, let's get started. Upon entering the Great War, Germany, like many other nations, actually did not have any sort of protective headgear. Most countries wore hats or caps, or in the case of Germany, the infamous Pickelhaube, which loosely translates to pimple helmet, which is pretty fun. But anyway, it was made out of boiled leather and offered very little, if any, ballistic protection whatsoever. So around 1915-16, that's when the country started realizing that they were taking a lot of casualties from head-related injuries. And so Germany, like other countries, began coming up with a design for a protective helmet that was preferably made out of something like steel. In December of 1915, production began on what would become the Stall Helm. Now, as you can see, this earlier version, commonly called the square dip by collectors, had a very defined skirt dip, which also led to stress fractures, quite frequently either during manufacturing or out in the field. So, only about 100,000 of these were produced, and then they would come out with what would become the 1916 Stall Helm. So, technically, the square dip would be the 1915 Stall Helm, and this guy right here is the 1916 Stall Helm that we're all familiar with. So you can see the skirt is very much more gradually tapered instead of that very square kind of edge. Still retaining the original Stall Helm design, of course. This is the original Stall Helm, but in case you didn't know about the 1915, that's kind of an interesting little tidbit about the Stall Helm. So we've got this guy right here. You can see it's got the chin strap that was supposed to be, there's little posts on the inside, which we'll get to the liner in a second. And you can see the rivets on the outside, the split pin up in front that holds the liner in, and then the famous lug. So those were actually air vents that also doubled as a bracket mount for this thing called the Stirnpanzer, which was a 1 centimeter thick brow plate that was attached via those lugs and a leather strap around the back of the helmet to provide a little bit of extra armor protection for machine gunners, sentries, and various other kind of assault troops. They weren't very widely used because they were so heavy, but that's what those lugs were actually there for. So now we're going to take a look at the liner system really quick, and starting with those posts that are on either side of the skirt on the inside, which I was mentioning earlier, that hold the chin strap on. Now these initial Model 16 and 15, if you will, helmets were not issued with chin straps immediately because the soldier was to take their Pickelhaube chin strap off of their Pickelhaube, which was no longer to be worn in a combat setting, and place it on these posts and use that to attach the helmet and keep it on their head. So that practice didn't last that long because the Pickelhaube chin straps weren't necessarily meant to hold this much weight, and the brass fittings would bend and they would fall off at inopportune times. Later on, well, actually very quickly, they started actually issuing chin straps with steel fittings that were stronger, and the soldier didn't have to provide it themselves. So the liner consists of a 3-pad leather system with a leather band that is held to the shell via these 3 split pins. There's one in the rear and one on either kind of the front sides, as you can see. Very quickly, there were issues with this leather band that was used to attach the liner to the helmet shell, and in 1917, what we call the Model 1917 Stall Helm kind of surfaced itself. Now, the only difference, as you can see, is the liner is the same 3-pad system, the chin straps are the same, steel fittings and whatnot, but the liner band attaching the liner to the helmet itself is made out of steel. This drastically increased durability, and it was used from 1917 onwards in this fashion. This brings us to the Model 1918 Stall Helm, and you'll notice right away that the chin strap post rivets are absent from the outside of the shell. That's because a lot of soldiers were complaining about them digging into their heads if they fell or something like that, and the chin straps were occasionally falling off. So in 1918, it was decided to feature an integral liner system that contained its own chin strap. As you can see here, it attaches by loops to the liner band itself, and the liner obviously still retains the steel band from the 1917. So, also in 1918, there was this helmet called the Cutout Helmet. Now, nobody actually knows what the purpose of these was for. They were only made at one factory, and they were only made in 2 sizes. And some say it's for cavalry, some say it's for officers talking on field phones. There's actually not a legitimate answer, and there's no records of it that are accurate and consistent. This also had the 1918 liner, but it's called the M18 Cutout. You can see a better picture of the chin strap there. So a lot of these helmets from the First World War were used through the 1920s after the First World War in Germany and around the world. Right here's a picture of the Freikorps in Germany post-World War I wearing the M18 Cutout Helmets. These pop up all over the place, even through the Third Reich. These are Reichswehr troops, the troops of the Weimar Republic wearing the Stall Helm, and these are more Freikorps members wearing what looks like the M18 Stall Helm. And now we fast forward to 1935 with the introduction of the Model 35 helmet. So this was a scaled down, lighter weight, a little bit smaller and more streamlined design of the original Stall Helm while still maintaining that really infamous skirted look. The big Stirnpanzer lugs were replaced with an air vent that was a separate piece that was pressed into place, as you can see, and the liner was still attached via the infamous split pin, as you can see right there. Decals were added on the original M35s based on branch, but again, I'll go into more detail on that sort of thing on my podcast at a later date. The liner system was also improved or upgraded, whatever you want to look at it, and it featured a 9-tongue leather system that was attached to a band that attached to the shell via split pin. These bands were made out of steel, aluminum, and zinc at certain points during the war, but again, that's a detailed thing, a nuanced thing that I'll go through on my podcast at a later date. The chin strap retained its kind of M18 roots with the loops attaching it. The chin strap was a lot smaller and a lot more streamlined. I mean, smaller as in thinner. The original one, as you can see, was a little bit wider. And it featured a really big buckle that was very strange. So these came in a couple different colors, mainly apple green and pea green are the commonly referred to terms. And the M35 would be worn throughout the entire Second World War. Some of them were retrofitted later on in the 1940s, but this is a design that you're going to see throughout the entire Second World War. In 1936, the need arose for a helmet specifically designed for paratroopers. So design began at that point and removed the skirt and the visor from the M35 Stall Helm and replaced it with a different liner system. The M36 was the first actual Fallschirmjäger helmet, and the M37 was sort of used, but the most common design you're going to see is what's in front of you, the Model 1938. This was designed this way to prevent risers and other equipment during jumps from getting caught on the skirts and the visor of the Stall Helm and possibly taking the head of the Fallschirmjäger with it. So that's why you have this very streamlined design, and it's very different than the regular Stall Helm that the infantry was using. So you've got these spanner bolts that are holding the liner system in, which we'll look at in a second. And you can see it's a little bit different than the typical look, but it still bears like that Germanic kind of appearance. The specially designed integral liner featured a 4-point chin strap for added support and stability during jumps and in wear in general. And it also featured foam padding. You can kind of see it on the outside of the leather right here. And it was also on the crown. You can see it underneath the leather. And it featured kind of a streamlined, full scalp coverage leather liner system for padding, comfort, and also ventilation. So it differs from the traditional 9-tongue infantry style, or the M31 liner, they call it, but it also provided necessary support for very specialized troops, such as the Fallschirmjäger. So here's a picture of some early Fallschirmjägers walking, marching, doing whatever in formation, and here's a later one with a splinter camo jump smock and no decals. This brings us to 1940 with the Model 1940 Stall Helm. Production numbers needed to be increased due to multiple fronts being open and the situation getting a little bit bigger than it was initially anticipated by the high command. So a fairly small but quite significant step was removed from the Stall Helm's manufacturing process. And as you can see here, the vent hole is no longer a separate piece that was pressed into the shell, but it is a stamped vent hole as part of the shell. So that reduces manufacturing needs for those specific air vents and also the materials and time that it takes to fit them to the helmet. The rest of the helmet remained generally the same with the rolled edges and such. This is how you can tell an M40 helmet in a picture like this is the stamped vent hole but the rolled edge. Now we're going to fast forward to 1942, where the Stall Helm's manufacturing process was even further simplified. So the difference between the M40 and the M42 is obviously the raw edge. It's not rolled under, which was quite time-consuming and deemed unnecessary. So you can tell that this is an M42 just by looking at it because of the flared edge. There's no roll, which makes it look nice and even like the M40 and the M35. So this reduced time to produce these things significantly, and I believe the steps were down to 4 steps to produce the shell. You've got the stamped vent holes still. The liner systems, again, that's a very nuanced thing. I'll go into that. Still remain the 9-tongue system with the chin strap, but there were some cheaper materials being used by this point in the war. So this is one that you're going to see from 1942 onwards, and it was issued very rapidly to troops on all fronts. Now, this brings us to post-World War II Germany, specifically West Germany. And for the first few years after the Second World War ended, the Border Guard Service, or Bundesgrenzschützer, and what was kind of existing of the German military, the shell of what remained, were wearing leftover Stall Helms until the 50s rolled around, and they kind of wanted to get away from that, Nazi Germany style look. And NATO was formed, and the UN was formed, and a lot of countries started going with the M1 helmet. So Germany began using surplus US M1 helmets, and then in 1956 to 1958, they started manufacturing their own M1 helmets. So they looked just like this, and the only thing about the German manufactured ones that's different than the U.S. surplus ones that they were using at that point is going to be the manufacturing marks. So these helmets would be worn through the 1960s by West German and BGS troops until we've got some updated helmets later. There's some German Marines wearing their awesome post-war splinter camouflage, wearing the surplus or possibly German-produced M1 steel helmets. At the same time, in 1958, the Germans were trying to produce their own version of the M1 that was more simplified, and it was called the Model 1960, or it is by the collectors that have them, because it was introduced around 1960. They started to be issued in 1958 in smaller numbers, but really it's known as the Model 1960, which you can see in front of you, also known as the M1A1. So it was an M1 style shell, but it was only one piece, so it meant there wasn't a detachable liner like the US M1 had and the later German-produced M1 had. And you can see that there are actually 4 rivets that hold this liner system in, and 2 rivets, one on each side, that hold the chin strap in place. In 1962, an improved version that streamlined manufacturing, sound familiar, was introduced. It was the same shell shape, the same one-piece design, but the 4 rivets that held the little split pins that held the old liner system in were removed. This allowed for more structural integrity. There's less holes drilled into the helmet, and it still had the chin strap loops that were held on by those rivets you can see on the side. Now, how do you attach the liner, you might ask? So this liner was actually attached via a screw through the top of the shell, as you can see right there, and it was kind of a more chintzy liner in my opinion, but the chin strap was the same, and the liner was updated to be more easily produced and more streamlined. Here's some soldiers wearing that, and these would continue to be worn until the 1990s by Bundeswehr troops. So, through the 1960s, the Fallschirmjäger, the West German Fallschirmjäger, were using leftover M38 shells, and they also had some that were post-war produced, but the design didn't generally change that much. Until, this is a cool picture with the M1s and the Fallschirmjäger helmets. I really like that. Until 1971, when it was deemed necessary to have the M1A1 style shell with a Fallschirmjäger friendly, we'll say, liner system. As you can see, the kind of spanner bolts, or the kind of screws that are sticking out holding the liner in, are very reminiscent of the M38 Fallschirmjäger helmet, and the chin strap was virtually identical, as you can see. It was even made out of the same color of leather as the World War II chin straps were, and it was very, very, very similar. A nice 4-point chin strap system. Now, the liner was very similar to the infantry liners, but you can see the foam padding around there, just like in the World War II helmets, that provided protection upon jumping and hitting the ground very, very hard. Here you can see a couple of Bundeswehr Fallschirmjäger. Some have helmet covers, some are just going bare, and it's a pretty cool helmet. Around 1985, some say as early as 1982, the M62 liner system and chin strap system was upgraded a little bit. You can see there's that plastic nape support, and it's just a little bit better built liner, and then it's got a 3-point chin strap now for more added support. This was introduced, it was typically called the 6285 or the M1A1M, and this would be worn through the 1990s until it was replaced by the next helmet that we're going to be talking about, which is the Shubert B826 Aramid helmet, which is the current issue of the Bundeswehr and many other countries. In the late 1980s, a lot of NATO countries were going towards a more Stall Helm-esque design of composite helmets, like the US M84 Pasget helmet and various other examples of Kevlar helmets and Aramid helmets. And so Germany, although they wanted to stay away from that classic Nazi Germany look, as they would call it, they realized that that was actually a superior design to the M1, and they were going to be making an Aramid helmet in that style. So that brings us to the Gefeshtelm 92, or the Shubert B826, but it's called the Gefeshtelm, the combat or battle helmet, model 1992, which is when it was unofficially or more so officially adopted by Germany for use in random places. You've got this nice liner here that's got A very comfortable setup with this nice leather sweatband, the kind of mesh netting for the crown, and this weird sort of molded plastic liner to absorb shock and stuff, plus a 3-point chin strap, which was an improvement, I think, over even the US M84 Pasget. So this is actually Germany's current issue helmet. They're talking about possibly, maybe, who knows, replacing it by 2024, 2025. But for now, this is the mainstay of the Bundeswehr, and it is widely issued still to this day. So there you have it, folks. The German military helmet from 1916 to the present day in 2022. So if you like this video and you want to see more content like this, let me know down in the comments. You can also become a channel sponsor, like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, by checking out the link in the description to my Patreon. Don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and share this video out if you found it very interesting. So thank you everybody so much for watching, and we'll see you on the next video.